The door creaked open, and what stood before him left the man frozen in shock. A German shepherd, bloodied and battered, was barely able to stand. His fur was torn, stained with blood, and his breathing came in ragged gasps. Despite the pain, the dog managed to lift his head, his eyes locking onto the man's with a look that spoke volumes. "Please," it seemed to say, as he took one shaky step forward, pleading for refuge. The man stood there, unable to move, as the dog slowly collapsed, falling just inches from his doorstep. What happened next would shake him to his core and change both their lives forever. Get ready for a story of unimaginable survival, trust, and a bond that could never be broken. The man stared at the German shepherd lying at his doorstep, his chest tightening with both fear and disbelief. The dog's heavy breathing was all he could hear, each labored gasp a painful reminder of the life-threatening injuries it had endured. The blood on the dog's fur was stark against the white snow, a chilling sign of how long he had been out there, fighting against the bitter cold. The man had lived in this secluded cabin for years, away from the hustle of city life, and had never expected to face something like this. He had seen animals come and go in the woods, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. The dog was clearly no ordinary stray. It had a strength in its eyes, despite the clear signs of exhaustion and pain. "Stay with me, boy," he whispered, kneeling beside the animal. He hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to help. His mind raced. The nearest town was miles away, and there was no one around for miles. The dog's wounds were too severe to ignore, deep cuts along its side, bleeding profusely, with no sign of an owner in sight. The situation was dire. With a deep breath, he gently reached out, running his hand through the dog's fur. The German shepherd flinched slightly but didn't pull away. The man could see the fear in its eyes, but also something else, an overwhelming trust, as if the dog knew that this man was its only chance. He could feel the weight of that trust pressing on him. How could he just turn his back on this dog in need? "Come on, buddy, I'll help you," he said, though the words felt inadequate for the severity of the situation. The man carefully lifted the dog, supporting its body as best as he could. The dog didn't fight him. Instead, it leaned into his embrace, its body trembling violently. He couldn't help but feel a deep pang in his chest. He had always been a loner, someone who had built a life of solitude. But this was different. This was an emergency, a life and death moment that brought two strangers together, bound by fate and the need for survival. As he moved through the door, he glanced over his shoulder one last time, as if expecting the harsh winter to swallow them whole. But the door shut behind him with a soft thud, sealing them inside. The warmth of the cabin seemed to breathe life into the dog for a moment, but the man knew that it wouldn't be enough. He had to do more. Much more. The dog's body sagged in his arms as he carefully laid it on the floor next to the fireplace. Its wounds were still bleeding, and he could see that it was struggling to stay awake. "Hold on, boy," the man said, quickly rushing to his first aid kit. He wasn't a vet, but he had learned how to treat cuts and bruises over the years. He grabbed some gauze and disinfectant, praying he wasn't too late. The man worked quickly, his hands shaking slightly as he cleaned the wounds and tried to stop the bleeding. The dog's eyes never left him, locked in an intense gaze that seemed to thank him with every movement. Minutes turned into hours as the man worked tirelessly, the fire crackling softly in the background. Despite the pain, the dog seemed to relax, its breathing steadier now, though still weak. The man could hardly believe what was happening. He had no idea who this dog was or where it had come from, but it didn't matter. It was here, and it needed him. With the worst of the wounds patched up, the man sat down beside the dog, watching it drift into an exhausted sleep. He felt a strange connection forming, one that he couldn't explain. It was as if this dog had come to him for a reason, maybe not just for help, but for something deeper, a bond that was starting to feel unbreakable. As the dog slept, the man looked out the window, his mind racing. What had brought this dog here? How had it survived the treacherous conditions? He knew that whatever story this dog had, it wasn't over yet. There was more to come, more pain to endure, more trust to build, and more challenges ahead. And somehow, the man knew he would face them all, side by side with this German shepherd. The following morning, the cabin was quiet, save for the soft crackle of the fire. The man woke early, the weight of the night's events still heavy in his chest. He had barely slept, his thoughts consumed with the injured dog lying on the floor. The German Shepherd was still there, curled up near the fireplace, its body stiff and unmoving. The man got up, stretching his sore muscles, and glanced at the dog. It was hard to tell if it had made any progress overnight. It was still breathing, though the shallow rise and fall of its chest indicated that it was still weak. He stepped closer, cautiously, not wanting to startle it. His eyes scanned the animal's wounds, each one a cruel reminder of the harsh conditions it had endured. The blood was drying, but the cut still looked raw and painful. He knelt beside the dog, reaching out a hand. It didn't flinch this time, but instead, it slowly lifted its head and looked at him with those pleading eyes. The man's heart clenched. There was something in those eyes, a mixture of gratitude and fear, as if the dog wasn't sure whether it could trust him fully yet. "Good boy," the man whispered, gently stroking its head. "We're gonna make it through this, okay?" The dog's tail gave a weak wag, and the man couldn't help but feel a surge of hope. Despite everything, the dog was still alive, still fighting. But that was only half the battle. The man knew that survival in the wild was a cruel game of chance, and he didn't have much time to waste. He needed to get the dog stronger. He needed to feed it, clean it up, and, most importantly, he needed to figure out where it had come from. With a deep breath, the man stood up and went to the small kitchen. He rummaged through his supplies, trying to find something suitable for the dog. He didn't have much in terms of dog food, but he had some leftover chicken and broth. He figured it would be a good start. When he returned, he saw that the dog was trying to lift itself, its legs trembling as it pushed against the floor. The man quickly set the bowl down in front of it, trying to encourage the dog to eat. "Come on, boy. Eat something. You need to regain your strength." The dog hesitated for a moment, its eyes flicking between the man and the food. Then, as if it couldn't hold back any longer, it slowly lowered its head and began to lap up the chicken broth. The man watched in silence, feeling a strange sense of relief. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As the dog ate, the man took a moment to survey the cabin. The snowstorm outside had calmed, but the world was still covered in a thick layer of white. The isolation of the cabin had never felt more real. He had always chosen this life for the peace it brought, but now he realized how vulnerable it made him. What if the dog had been part of a pack? What if it had a family out there, somewhere? And more importantly, how had it ended up so badly hurt in the first place? The man shook the thoughts from his head. He needed to focus on the here and now. He couldn't afford to think too much about the past. After the dog finished eating, it collapsed back onto the floor, clearly exhausted. The man went to work cleaning the wounds again, carefully tending to each injury. His hands were steady, but his mind was racing. He needed to figure out what had happened. As he worked, the dog let out a small whimper, the sound barely audible but full of pain. The man paused for a moment, looking at the dog with sympathy. This wasn't just about helping an animal, it was about something deeper. The dog had come to him for a reason. The bond between them was already forming, and though it was fragile, it was real. As he finished tending to the wounds, the dog's breathing steadied. The man sat back on his heels, wiping the sweat from his brow. He had done everything he could for now. But what was the next step? Was the dog truly alone? And what had caused its injuries? The man stood up and walked to the window, peering out at the vast wilderness. The snow was falling again, the world outside as cold and unforgiving as ever. But for the first time in a long while, he felt like he wasn't so alone. The dog had chosen him. And now, he had to choose whether he would help it survive, no matter what the cost. The days blurred together as the man settled into a rhythm of caring for the German Shepherd. He spent hours each day tending to its injuries, feeding it small amounts of food, and watching carefully as the dog regained its strength, slowly but steadily. The dog's coat was still matted and bloodstained, but the wounds were healing. The man noticed that each time the dog looked up at him, its gaze seemed to convey something more, an unspoken gratitude, an understanding of the bond they were forming. But despite the dog's progress, the man couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to this story, something he wasn't seeing. One morning, after feeding the dog and watching it drink water, the man decided it was time to go outside. The storm had passed, leaving behind a crystal clear sky and the faint sound of birds in the distance. The snow-covered landscape stretched out before him, the wilderness both beautiful and intimidating. He stepped outside, his boots crunching in the fresh snow, and looked around. The dog had clearly been through something horrible, and there were no signs of it having come from a nearby town or home. There were no tracks leading to the cabin, nothing to explain how it had ended up on his doorstep. The man's curiosity gnawed at him, and he knew that he couldn't just ignore the mystery. His gaze wandered across the landscape, scanning for any sign of life. He was about to turn back to the cabin when something caught his eye. Off in the distance, a shape moved. A figure, walking slowly toward him. The man squinted, his heart racing. The figure was too far away to make out clearly, but it was definitely a person. He turned quickly and rushed back inside, his pulse quickening. Was this someone looking for the dog? Or was there something else going on? Inside, the German Shepherd was resting near the fire, its eyes tracking the man's every move. The dog stood up, its body shaky but determined. It had grown stronger over the past few days, and the sight of it trying to stand on its own filled the man with a renewed sense of hope. But the dog's eyes, those intelligent, intense eyes, locked onto the man in a way that made him stop in his tracks. "Stay here," the man said, his voice softer than he intended. He grabbed his jacket and quickly stepped outside again, his heart pounding in his chest. The figure in the distance was moving closer, and the man had to know who it was. He couldn't help but feel a sense of unease, a nagging feeling that something was off. As he walked toward the figure, he couldn't shake the thought that perhaps this person was connected to the dog. Maybe it was someone who had been hunting the dog, or someone who knew its story. He needed answers. As he approached, the figure came into clearer view. A tall man, rugged and dressed in worn clothes, carrying a heavy pack on his back. His face was weathered, but the look in his eyes was strangely familiar, almost like he'd been expecting the man. "Hey," the man called out, raising a hand to greet him. "Who are you? What are you doing here?" The stranger stopped in his tracks, his eyes flicking between the man and the cabin. He seemed cautious, but also curious. "I could ask you the same thing," he replied, his voice low but steady. The man took a step forward, trying to read the stranger's expression. "I'm asking first. That dog, what do you know about it?" The stranger's face hardened at the mention of the dog. His eyes narrowed, and for a moment, the man thought he saw a flicker of guilt, or perhaps fear, pass across his face. "That dog doesn't belong to you," the stranger said, his voice colder now. The man's mind raced. "What do you mean, it doesn't belong to me? I found it outside, barely alive. It's hurt, and I'm trying to help it." The stranger's eyes shifted, and for the first time, the man noticed the weariness in his expression. "I wasn't talking about you. I'm talking about the dog." A chill ran down the man's spine. There was something unsettling about this stranger, something that didn't sit right, but he couldn't back down now. "Why are you so concerned about that dog?" the man pressed, stepping closer. The stranger hesitated, then let out a deep sigh. "It's not just any dog," he said quietly. "It's a working dog, trained for something far more dangerous than you can imagine." The man's heart skipped a beat. "A working dog? What do you mean?" The stranger's eyes darted toward the cabin, his expression unreadable. "You need to keep that dog inside. It's not safe. And neither are you." Before the man could ask more, the stranger turned and walked away, disappearing into the trees. The man stood frozen, his mind racing. What had he just heard? And who was this man? Why did he seem so intent on keeping the dog hidden? As he stood there, the wind howled in the distance, and the man's thoughts returned to the dog, lying helpless in his cabin, trusting him to keep it safe. He didn't understand everything yet, but he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just a simple rescue. There was more to the dog's past, and more danger on the horizon, and whatever came next, he had to be ready. The man stood at the edge of the cabin, staring out at the snow-covered forest. The stranger's words echoed in his mind, each one heavier than the last. "It's a working dog, trained for something far more dangerous than you can imagine." The chill in the air seemed to grow sharper as the weight of those words sank in. He didn't know what to make of it. What did the dog have to do with anything dangerous? It was just a wounded animal, struggling to survive. The man hadn't asked for this. He'd only wanted to help. But now, It seemed as if helping this dog had opened a door to something far darker than he could have imagined. Inside, the dog was resting near the fire, its breathing steady but still fragile. It had made progress since arriving, but the journey ahead was far from over. The man had tended to its wounds, fed it, and tried to comfort it, but he still had so many questions. What was this dog's past? Why had it been out there alone, so far from any town or civilization? And who was that stranger, really? As he stepped back inside, the man noticed the dog's eyes flicking toward him, as if sensing his unease. The German Shepherd's gaze was steady, intelligent, and almost knowing. The man crouched down beside it, gently resting a hand on its head. "Hey boy, what's your story?" he murmured, his voice soft. The dog blinked at him, as if contemplating the question. Then, with a small groan, it pushed itself to its feet, stumbling a bit before finding its balance. The man watched, his heart in his throat. The dog was getting stronger, but there was something about it, something in the way it moved, that felt off. It was as if it was holding back, as if there was more it wasn't showing. The dog's eyes flicked toward the door, then back to the man. It was clear that something had changed between them. The bond was growing, but so was the tension. The dog's silent gaze seemed to speak volumes. "You need to be ready. Danger is coming." Suddenly, a loud knock echoed from the door, making both the man and the dog jump. The man's pulse quickened. Who could it be this time? His heart raced as he hesitated. The stranger from earlier? Or someone else? Without thinking, he moved quickly toward the door, looking out through the small window next to it. Through the frost-covered glass, he could barely make out a figure. A man, standing just at the edge of the trees. His breath fogged the window as the man pressed his face against it, trying to get a better look. "Stay here," he whispered to the dog, moving cautiously toward the door. The dog didn't protest, but its eyes followed every movement the man made. The man opened the door a crack, peering outside. The figure in the snow didn't move, just stood there, watching him. "Can I help you?" the man called out, his voice cautious but firm. The figure didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stepped forward, his boots crunching in the snow. As he drew closer, the man's breath caught in his throat. It was the same stranger, the one who had warned him earlier. "I told you to keep the dog inside," the stranger said, his voice low and urgent. The man's heart skipped a beat. "What do you want? Why are you back?" The stranger's eyes flicked to the cabin, his face serious and filled with an intensity that made the man uneasy. "The dog's not just a regular animal. It's part of something bigger, something you're not ready for." The man clenched his fists, trying to keep his emotions in check. "What the hell does that mean? What's really going on?" The stranger's gaze softened, just for a moment. Then, without warning, he pushed past the man and stepped inside the cabin. The man had no choice but to let him in, his mind racing with questions. "Keep your voice down," the stranger whispered, his eyes darting around the cabin. "You don't understand. They'll be looking for him, and if they find him here..." He let the words hang in the air, heavy with threat. The man's stomach churned. Who are they? And why is this dog so important? The stranger didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked over to the dog, who was now standing near the fire, watching him with wary eyes. The German Shepherd took a step back, growling low in its throat, as if sensing the danger in the stranger's presence. "It's not safe for you to keep him here," the stranger said, his voice tight with urgency. "They'll stop at nothing to get him back. You don't know who you're dealing with." The man felt a cold shiver run down his spine. "Who are you?" he asked again, his voice rising with frustration. "Why won't you just tell me what's going on?" The stranger turned toward him, his eyes dark with something the man couldn't place. Fear, perhaps, or guilt. "I'm someone who's trying to protect you from making a huge mistake. You think you're helping this dog, but you're pulling yourself into something you can't undo." The words hit the man like a punch to the gut. He looked over at the dog, its eyes still locked on the stranger, and for the first time he wondered if he was in way over his head. What had he brought into his home? And how far would he be willing to go to protect the dog, knowing now that it wasn't just a wounded animal, It was a key piece in something much darker, much more dangerous. The man's mind was racing. Whatever this was, it was only just beginning. The stranger's words hung in the air like a storm cloud, dark and threatening. The man stood frozen, trying to process everything he'd just heard. The dog, his new companion, wasn't just an injured animal. It was part of something much bigger, something that could change everything. The stranger's presence felt oppressive, as if he was a walking shadow in the cabin, every movement and word calculated. The man wasn't sure whether to trust him or push him out, but the truth was, he had no answers of his own. He'd only tried to help a dog that had stumbled into his life, and now he was caught in the middle of something he couldn't even understand. The dog, for its part, had remained eerily calm, its piercing gaze fixed on the stranger. It wasn't growling anymore, but it wasn't entirely relaxed either. It was waiting for something. The man turned away from the stranger, his mind spinning. Who are they? Who's looking for the dog? The stranger hesitated for a moment, then looked at the dog, his eyes filled with a kind of sorrow. It's a special kind of program, something most people don't know about. These dogs, like him, they're bred for a purpose that involves tracking, hunting, and worse. The man felt his stomach tighten. Tracking, hunting. You mean these dogs are used for something illegal? The stranger shook his head. Not illegal, at least not in the way you're thinking. They're trained for military and government purposes. They're used in high-risk operations. They're bred to be strong, loyal, and intelligent, but they're also trained to handle things no dog should ever have to. And when they're no longer needed, his voice trailed off, and the man could see the regret in his eyes. So, this dog, it's been through all that? It was part of some operation? The man's heart was racing. He glanced at the German shepherd, who was now sitting on the floor, looking up at him as if to say, "You're starting to understand." The stranger nodded. Yes, this dog, this shepherd, was part of a covert operation, a mission that went wrong. After the mission failed, the team left him behind. They abandoned him. And now, they're coming for him. The weight of the words hit the man like a ton of bricks. His mind struggled to grasp the enormity of what he was hearing. A military-trained dog? A failed operation? He couldn't believe it. It all felt like something out of a movie, not real life. But looking at the dog, at the intelligence in its eyes, the way it stood watch over him, the quiet resilience, it made sense. The man's thoughts were interrupted by a sharp knock on the door. His pulse jumped. He hadn't heard the stranger leave. Was it them? Was it the people the stranger had warned him about? The stranger immediately stepped toward the door, his body tense. "They're here," he muttered, his eyes wide with fear. The man grabbed the rifle that was leaning against the wall. He didn't know what to expect, but he knew he wasn't going to just hand the dog over without a fight. "Stay inside," he said to the stranger. Then, turning to the dog, he added, "Stay close." The dog stood up, its body tense. It had been injured and fragile only days ago, but now it seemed more alive than ever, a silent force ready to defend itself and him. The man moved cautiously toward the door, his heart hammering in his chest. He could hear the faint sound of boots crunching in the snow, and a voice shouting from the distance. They were getting closer. "Who are you?" the man called out as he opened the door a crack, his rifle in hand. Outside stood two men, both wearing dark coats and armed with rifles of their own. They were serious, professional, and they didn't look like they were here for a friendly visit. "Step aside," one of the men ordered, his voice cold and commanding. "We're here for the dog. We know you have him." The man felt a surge of protectiveness. He wasn't going to let them take the dog. He had already made that decision. "I'm not handing him over to anyone," he said firmly, his voice low, but steady, not without answers. The second man stepped forward, a slow smile creeping across his face. "You don't understand, do you? This isn't a choice. The dog belongs to us. He's property of the government. He was trained for a mission. And now he's part of something much bigger than you. The words felt like a slap to the face. You're telling me this dog is a weapon? Some kind of tool for your operations? The first man nodded. He's not just any dog. He's one of the best we've ever had. And now you've gone and interfered. We can't let you keep him. For your safety. And for his. The man's grip tightened on the rifle. He didn't know how far these men were willing to go, but one thing was clear. They weren't here to negotiate. They weren't here to make peace. They were here to take what they believed was theirs, and they were willing to do whatever it took to get it back. Stay back, the man warned, his heart pounding in his chest. The German Shepherd was standing beside him now, its body poised and alert. You're not taking him anywhere. The two men exchanged glances. The air between them crackled with tension, the snowstorm forgotten as the confrontation escalated. The man didn't know what would happen next, but he knew this. He wasn't going to let them take the dog, not without a fight. The standoff at the door felt like an eternity. The man's grip on the rifle was steady, but his heart was racing, pounding in his chest like a drum. The German Shepherd stood close beside him, its eyes locked on the two strangers, who were now sizing him up like a hunter would a target. Listen, the first man said, his tone more insistent now. We don't want to hurt you. We just want the dog. If you hand him over peacefully, no one has to get hurt. The man's jaw tightened. Peacefully? It was clear that they weren't here for any kind of peace. These men weren't looking for compromise. They were looking for control. And that wasn't something he could give them. Not after everything that had happened. Not after everything he had learned. You don't understand, the man said, his voice low but firm. This dog isn't just some tool for you to use. He's alive. He's been through hell, and I'm not going to let you drag him back into whatever mess you've made of his life. The second man, who had remained silent up until now, took a step forward, his eyes narrowing. You really think you have a choice in this? The first man raised his hand, signaling his partner to stay back. We didn't want to do this the hard way, but if you insist on making this difficult. He pulled out a small device from his pocket, something that resembled a small remote, and pressed a button. The air around them seemed to thicken, and for a split second, the man had no idea what was happening. His confusion quickly turned to shock as a high-pitched beeping noise filled the air, emanating from the device. It was almost like a signal, and then, just as suddenly as it had started, the dog let out a sharp, pained cry. A cry so raw and filled with terror that it shook the very foundation of the cabin. The man spun around, eyes wide, to see the dog stumbling back, its body seizing in a violent spasm. It was as if something inside it had snapped. No! The man yelled, rushing forward to catch the dog, but it was already backing away from him, its eyes wide with fear, confusion, and pain. The stranger with the device smirked. We've implanted a tracking chip in every one of our dogs. It's synced to this device. When we need them to obey, we activate it. It's for their own good, really. Keeps them in line, keeps them from running. The man's heart sank. The dog wasn't free. It never had been. This wasn't a rescue. It was a trap, and he'd walked right into it. The German Shepherd was now trembling, its body shaking uncontrollably as it fought against the device's control. But despite the pain, there was a fierce fire in its eyes. It wasn't going to give in, not without a fight. The man turned to face the two men, fury igniting within him. You've been torturing him this whole time, haven't you? He spat, his voice low and dangerous. You think you can just use him like a puppet and take him back like some kind of tool? Well, not anymore. The man threw the rifle down to the floor, his hands shaking with rage. This wasn't just about the dog anymore. It was about everything the dog had suffered, everything it had endured. It was about the lies these men had fed him, the control they had tried to maintain over him. He wouldn't let them win. You won't take him, the man said through gritted teeth. Not today. Not ever. Without warning, he rushed at the first man, knocking him off balance and sending him crashing to the ground. The second man immediately raised his rifle, but before he could fire, the German Shepherd lunged forward, its teeth bared in a flash of pure instinct. The dog's bite was swift and precise. tearing into the second man's arm. The man yelled in pain, dropping the rifle and stumbling backward. But the dog wasn't finished. It pressed forward, using every ounce of strength it had to protect the man who had saved it. The first man scrambled to his feet, pulling out a gun, but the man had already tackled him to the ground, fists flying. The air was filled with the sounds of shouting, grunts, and the crackle of struggle as both men fought to regain control. And then, in the chaos, the man heard something that froze his blood. A helicopter, the low hum of the blades growing louder, cutting through the cold air, growing closer. It was coming for them. "Get in the truck!" one of the men screamed, his voice full of panic. "We're out of time." The man didn't know what to do. He glanced toward the dog, who was still standing by him, eyes wild with fear, but also determination. The dog wasn't giving up. It wasn't going back to them. The man grabbed the dog's collar, pulling it close as he took a deep breath. "We're not going anywhere with them," he muttered to himself. The helicopter's whir grew louder, closer. Time was running out. Without another word, the man yanked open the cabin door and pulled the dog inside, slamming it shut behind them. He rushed toward the back, looking for a way out, a way to escape. He couldn't let them win. Not now. Not after everything they'd been through. But outside, the helicopter's shadow was already passing over the cabin, its looming presence a reminder of the storm that was closing in. The fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The cabin felt like it was closing in around the man and the dog. The helicopter hovered just overhead, casting a long shadow over the snow-covered ground. The man's pulse thundered in his ears as he grabbed the rifle and dashed toward the back of the cabin, his mind racing. They couldn't stay here. The two men outside would never give up. They would keep coming, no matter what. And the helicopter above, it was a warning, a signal that the clock was ticking. He glanced down at the German Shepherd, who was now sitting by his side, its eyes alert but calm. There was a connection between them now, stronger than anything the man had ever experienced. This dog had been through hell, and it wasn't about to let anything, or anyone, take it back. Not after everything it had survived, and neither would he. The man took a deep breath and looked around the small cabin. There was no escape through the front door, not with the helicopter right above them, but there had to be another way. He turned toward the back wall, his eyes scanning for anything that could help. And then he saw it. A small window, barely large enough for a person to squeeze through, but it was their only chance. "This way," the man muttered, moving quickly to the window. The dog followed, its body agile despite its injuries. The man tried to lift the window, but it was frozen shut. He gritted his teeth and pushed harder, using his body weight to force it open. With a final heave, the window cracked open just wide enough for them to fit. "Come on, boy," he whispered, coaxing the dog through the opening. The shepherd hesitated for a moment, but then it darted through, its body moving with surprising grace. The man followed closely behind, slipping out of the cabin just as the helicopter's roar intensified. They had no time to waste. He could hear the men outside shouting now, their voices growing more frantic as they realized their target was slipping away. The man and the dog ran through the snow, hearts pounding, adrenaline surging. The trees ahead provided some cover, but he knew they couldn't outrun the helicopter. They needed a plan, and fast. Just as he was about to glance over his shoulder to assess their progress, the sound of the helicopter suddenly stopped. The roar faded into a heavy silence, broken only by the crunch of their footsteps in the snow. He paused, confused. What was happening? The sound of the helicopter's engines sputtered, then went silent, and then, as if in slow motion, he saw the helicopter dip lower, its shadow darkening the snow beneath it. It was coming down. The man's heart leapt in his chest. The helicopter, unable to stay airborne any longer, crashed into the trees behind the cabin with a deafening roar. The ground shook beneath him as a plume of smoke erupted into the sky. The crash was so violent that it sent a shockwave through the forest, knocking the man and the dog to the ground. For a moment, there was only chaos, dust, smoke, and debris everywhere. But then, as the noise faded, the man pushed himself up and looked over at the dog. The German Shepherd was standing, its body covered in dirt, but its eyes were still focused. There was no fear in its gaze, just strength. And in that moment, the man understood. They had survived. They had both fought against their own limits, against the odds, and now they had a chance, a real chance. The man didn't know what would happen next, but he knew that the path ahead wouldn't be easy. They would have to keep moving, keep running, because the people who were after them wouldn't stop. But for the first time, the man felt hope rise inside him. They were no longer just running from danger. They were running toward something better, toward a future where they could finally be free. The dog trotted over to his side, its tail wagging ever so slightly, a silent promise between them. Whatever came next, they would face it together. He took a deep breath and looked out toward the horizon. It was a new day, a new beginning, and this time they would fight for it. The man smiled. "We're going to be okay, boy. We're going to be okay." With that, he turned, his hand gently resting on the dog's back as they walked deeper into the forest, away from the wreckage and toward the unknown. But they weren't afraid anymore. Together, they were unstoppable. The journey of the man and the German Shepherd proves that no obstacle is too great when you have loyalty and courage by your side. Together, they faced the impossible and emerged stronger. This is more than just a story about survival. It's about the unbreakable bond between humans and animals, a bond that can overcome any challenge. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, like this video, and share it with someone who believes in the power of resilience and friendship. Stay tuned for more inspiring stories.